Welcome to Western District, actually Western Region Pastors Network, our institute. Off to a great start. This is lecture number 8 for Exegesis and Hermeneutics, and we will be dealing specifically with some of the content of chapter 12 from Moises Silva and Walter Kaiser's book, Introduction to Biblical Hermeneutics, The Search for Meaning. And the title of this chapter is called, What About the Future? The Meaning of Prophecy. I have mixed feelings about this chapter. I thought it was good in places, and other places I felt it was a little vague and not very clear, and in other places I thought slightly misleading. So I'm going to follow roughly the outline given by Kaiser in his chapter on prophecy. I'm going to interject some of my own thoughts and ideas about that, and then give you some additional information that I think is helpful and important for interpreting prophecy. And I want to start out by just actually reading the first couple paragraphs of this chapter to you. So it says, the topic of prophecy all too frequently produces one of two extremes in readers and interpreters: a wholesale avoidance and a general apathy toward the subject, which is usually due to the excesses observed in its use by some, or secondly, the creation of a hobby horse. Both responses are inadequate and in need of the balance that is presented in the biblical text. Prophecy is a much larger biblical genre than most people think. Many connect the word prophecy with the idea of futurology, but the bulk of prophecy in both the earlier prophets, that is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the 12 minor prophets, along with the New Testament prophets, actually involved God's messengers speaking the word of God to a contemporary culture that needed to be challenged to cease its resistance to the word of God and to change its ways. As such, these prophets were forth-tellers. The aspect of prophecy that is more difficult to interpret is the portion that deals with foretelling. The number of predictions about the future in the Bible is so large in both testaments that it carries with it a silent rebuke for any who have been hesitant to enter into the study of this subject. According to the calculations of J. Barton Payne, there are 8,352 verses with predictive material in them, out of 31,124 verses in the whole Bible. A staggering 27% of the Bible deals with predictions about the future. Now, as I read that passage, I thought, wow, it's more than I thought. And as I read more in Kaiser, I see that he's including quite a bit more than you're expecting that he would include into this category of prophecy. Now, I do think it's instructive to speak about prophecy and what exactly it is that we're talking about when we talk about prophecy, because prophecy is a term that has a wide breadth of meaning really in the Christian world. And as he said, in the Bible, there's two main distinctions of prophecy. You have what's called forthtelling, or simply prophets who spoke forth God's word and called people to a repentance and to a listening to God's word that they basically already knew and were aware of, but that they were straying from. And we're going to tie this really closely into some of the categories that Kaiser brings up that you might not necessarily have thought of as prophetic, because he includes in this broad category of prophecy. And I'm not sure about Payne, because I haven't read Payne, although this particular quote and reference is all over the internet. If you Google that question, how much of the Bible is predictive prophecy, it all comes back to this statement by Payne, who wrote this in a book called The Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy. And if he's including what Kaiser is including, then it's quite an inflated number, because I think you're going to agree with me that much of what we're talking about is not what we normally would have included in prophetic, or in the prophetic. So the forthtelling of the prophets is the one category, And then the foretelling of the future, particular events that might come to pass, everything from the prediction of Nebuchadnezzar destroying the city of Tyre in the book of Ezekiel to the coming of Christ. And then what we might argue about are references to a yet future return or second coming of Christ would be included in that predictive category of prophecy. I think it's important to talk about the biblical definition, the New Testament definition of prophecy at this point too, which is found in 1 Corinthians 14:3, where it says that one who prophesies speaks to men for edification, exhortation, and consolation. And unless you include in that, in the definition of maybe edification or exhortation or consolation, some element of predictive prophecy, that definition of prophecy seems to limit what the prophetic is as well. But for our purposes today, when we talk about interpreting the Bible and interpreting prophecy, we're actually talking about interpreting what we might call predictive prophecy. And so in that vein, I think it's important to talk about some of the characteristics of prophecy. And maybe we want to just start with this idea of the prophetic perspective and the idea of the possibility of double meaning. And we'll come back to this at the end of the lecture and take a look at Isaiah chapters 7 and 8 to try and give us a little bit of help with regard to this. But prophetic perspective occurs quite frequently in the Old Testament prophets. It's a phenomenon of blending together both the near and the distant aspects of the prediction in the one and the same vision. I think we've talked about this before in some context class when we talked about the near and the far reference, that in prophecy there appears to be an immediate or a fulfillment that occurs very quickly after the prophecy, and especially within the life of the prophet himself. And then there seems to be a more ultimate destination for that prophecy as well. And so oftentimes this is referred to as double fulfillment, and oftentimes it's referred to as prophetic perspective or prophetic foreshortening. And one of the major illustrations to talk about this is that it seems as if the prophet is standing on a particular plateau or place, and as he looks forward through the prophetic lens, he can see two mountain peaks, and those two mountain peaks are the content of his prophecy. They would be what he speaks of. And what he can't tell is the distance of the valley that separates those two peaks, which would represent time passing. And so oftentimes it's spoken of as that the prophet is speaking of two separate events in one event. Hence the idea of the prophetic perspective or double fulfillment. And so we want to talk about that because one of the principles we've talked about in hermeneutics and exegesis is that passages have a single meaning. They don't have multiple meanings. So if a particular prophetic passage has a double meaning, what does that do for that initial basic principle of exegesis? Is it a violation of that principle? So it's been an idea that's been talked about throughout history with regard to how we do exegesis and how we deal with the prophetic. So it's good to be aware of that idea and its existence. What I'd like to share with you, though, from Kaiser's book is that he gives 4 principles for interpreting prophecy. And the first principle that he gives is that unconditional prophecies must be distinguished from conditional and sequential ones. Unconditional prophecies must be distinguished from conditional and sequential ones. So first thing we have to do is define what we mean by unconditional prophecies, conditional prophecies, and sequential ones. And here is where initially we're going to discover that when Payne and Kaiser talk about prophecy and the amount of prophecy that is found in the Bible, you're going to be surprised by what they include in that. Because in this first category of unconditional prophecies, we're really looking at covenant promises that God has made. And so the promises that God makes in the context of covenant would be considered prophetic because they are describing a particular future that is not yet in play. The example or the definition that Kaiser gives for unconditional prophecy is unilateral. These prophecies are unilateral in that they do not depend in any sense for their fulfillment on any mortal's obedience or pledge to maintain them. And the example he gives is from Genesis chapter 15. And this is in the context of the covenant promise made to Abraham. And if you remember from that passage, there is a carving up of an animal and the creating of an aisle, and God passes himself through that aisle. So they cut, this is Genesis chapter 15, verse 9. Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought all these to them and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. Behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You'll be buried in a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So there's your predictive prophecy that is made to Abraham by God. It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, Kenizzite, the Catamite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, and so on and so forth. Now, what you have there is a picture of a covenant agreement, the cutting of the animals and the laying them apart, the halves on opposite sides of one another, where there would be an aisle in between. Typically in that covenant context, both parties would walk between the animals. And the symbolism there is, as they walk between the animals, the statement that they're making is, if I fail my end of the covenant bargain with you, may it be done to me as it's been done to these animals. May I be cut in two. It's this high level of promise. But what you want to notice in this particular promise that God makes to Abraham is that it appears to be unilateral. Abraham is not asked to pass between those pieces, just this picture that of God passes between the pieces. And so this is what Kaiser is referring to as an unconditional prophecy. We might say it's an unconditional promise. We wouldn't typically speak of it in terms of that prophetic, but you can see where it is prophetic. I will give you this land. You're going to go to Egypt. You're going to be there for 400 years. You yourself are going to die. You'll be okay. Your people will come back here. And so this prophecy or this prophetic statement that's made to Abraham is unconditional, has no conditions assigned to it. God will do this. And so that would be the first category of prophecy or predictive prophecy that we see here. Some other unconditional covenants in the Bible that Kaiser raises are God's covenant with the seasons in Genesis 8:21 through 23. God's promise that a Davidic king would be on the throne forever in 2 Samuel 7 verses 8 through 16. God's promise of a new covenant, Jeremiah 31:31 to 34, and God's promise of a new heaven and a new earth in Isaiah 65:17 following, and chapter 66:22 to 24. So that will be the first category the prophetic. So remember, the principle we're talking about here is that unconditional prophecies must be distinguished from conditional and sequential ones. And so those are some of the major ones of the unconditional prophecies in the Bible. The second category are conditional prophecies. Again, you might be a little surprised that these would fall into the category of prophetic, but the majority of Old Testament prophecies are conditional. And the major places where we're going to find examples of conditional prophecies are going to be in the book of Leviticus, chapters 26, and the book of Exodus, chapters 28 through 32. So let me just quickly turn to Leviticus chapter 26 and read you an example of what is going to be considered a conditional prophecy, or part of unilateral covenant promises, or bilateral covenant promises. Unilateral would be one party is making the covenant promises. Bilateral would be two parties making a covenant promise. Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in their season, so that the land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. So that would be considered a conditional prophecy. It's conditional upon obedience. If you do this, then I will do this. So conditional prophecies typically are promises of blessing or judgment. And so the words if and unless are often attached to those prophecies. As I mentioned, these two categories typically are not what we generally initially would think of when we thought about interpreting the prophetic. The last category in this first principles arena is what we call sequential prophecies. And sequential prophecies place several events together in one prediction, even though they will be fulfilled in a sequence and a series of acts, perhaps stretching over several centuries. So one of the examples he gives is the prophecy of Ezekiel of Nebuchadnezzar destroying the city of Tyre. And if you read Ezekiel, the appropriate passages, chapter 26, verses 7 through 14, chapter 29, verses 17 to 20, it appears that there is, number one, a complete destruction of the city, and secondly, that many nations will participate in this complete destruction of the city. Nebuchadnezzar is specifically mentioned. Nebuchadnezzar does, in fact, conquer the city of Tyre. He wipes it out. But he doesn't completely destroy the people or the remnant of the people of Tyre. In fact, they scoot out to an island and kind of reconstruct their existence on this island off the coast. It's not till many years later that Alexander the Great, being a Russian, I was going to say Peter the Great, but Alexander the Great again comes down and conquers Tyre, and this time he totally destroys it. He actually uses the rubble from the city to build a causeway to the island, and then he totally wipes out the city of Tyre. So what's being said there is that it's not wrong that Nebuchadnezzar is listed as the primary in this process, and that many nations are listed in this process, when what we're looking at is a sequence of events that could happen even over an extended period of time. So sequential prophecies basically put several events together in one prediction. And sometimes that happens more quickly, or sometimes it happens in a more extended way. So the first principle, again, after now I've given you those three definitions of what's involved in it, unconditional prophecies must be distinguished from conditional and sequential ones. So that's Kaiser's first principle of interpreting prophecies. The second principle is that terms borrowed from Israel's history may be used to express the future. When you read the prophetic, it's often very graphic in its language. In fact, that's one of the questions that is often brought up in the conversation about prophecy. Do we take it literally, or do we take it symbolically? Is it a metaphor? What exactly does that mean? And so we want to make sure that we do understand that prophetic language. And it's important to define what we mean by interpreting something literally and something figuratively, and the importance of that. So do we understand passages literally or figuratively or spiritually? And that's an important question to ask. And I'm looking for a quote from Raymond Brown that I wanted to read at this point for you. I might have to ask you to indulge me for a second. Yeah, here it is. What is meant by the literal sense? Raymond Brown defined it as the sense which the human author intended and which his words convey, which is kind of an all-encompassing way to speak about that. Typically, when we talk about it in our modern conversation about literal or figurative, symbolic or literal, we're generally talking about how two camps approach the scriptures. One camp would approach the scriptures by saying, we believe that you need to take the text literally. And what they mean by that is that when God promises things to Israel, they're going to be fulfilled to Israel. And others say, well, there's a more of a symbolic interpretation or understanding, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that all those things will be fulfilled by literal Israel. And you get a lot of discussion about this, but typically that's the conversation that goes from camp to camp. And I do like Brown's definition, the sense with which human authors intended and which his words convey, because if I mean something to be literal or sarcastic or metaphorical, if you take it that way, if you take it in its figurative sense, you are taking me literally at my word the way I intended it. But what the term literal now is becoming to mean is we need to take it as the Bible means what it says. So when it says a locust, it means a locust. When it says a nation, it means a nation. When it says a cloud, it means a cloud. It doesn't mean something other than that. So when we get to the second principle, we start to glean out how we treat prophetic language. And I don't think it's really helpful in our current context to use that distinction, literal or figurative. I think it's better just to use Brown's sense. We want to understand the words that are used in the way that the author intended and the meaning that he intended to convey. So what we find oftentimes is that in creation, or in the language that's used, terms are borrowed from Israel's history to talk about these bigger pictures. So for instance, creation is used as the foundation for this future idea of a new heavens and a new earth that's used as kind of a prototype or a model or a predictive prophecy in history, maybe not used with words but used in action. Paradise is referred to in the book of Genesis, and so we have a future paradise that's referred to in the book of Revelation, the book of Isaiah. Even Jesus talks about to the man on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. So it's this usage of this Old Testament picture to frame or to define a New Testament or a future reality. The flood is often used as a symbol of judgment. Not necessarily that God will flood people, but he uses it by analogy. So in Matthew 24 and all of that discourse, the flood is used just as in the days of Noah. One will be taken, one will be left behind. And then Peter also uses it in 2 Peter. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is also used as a prototype for judgment, and the judgment language is used then throughout the rest of the Bible. 2 Peter 2:6, Matthew 10:15, Revelation 14:10, Revelation 19:20. Those passages use the picture of Sodom and Gomorrah as a picture of judgment. Not necessarily that Sodom and Gomorrah will be recreated or the flood will be recreated as God's judging act, but that God will judge. And those are the prototypes for judgment that are used in the Old Testament. Oftentimes in prophetic language, they are used to symbolize judgment. It's not that there isn't a referent, there is. God will judge, but we just use these major, big, flowing ideas as kind of the movement for judgment. The Exodus is also one of the terms borrowed from Israel's history, used to express the future. And so throughout the book of Revelation, throughout the book of Isaiah, you have Exodus terminology used and Exodus pictures used to paint the new picture of the future. The wilderness experience is another one. Achan's sin and the valley of trouble is another one. And one of maybe the most popular ones, or the ones that came to my mind that Kaiser doesn't reference in the book, if you've read it, is the usage by Jesus of the picture of the snake being lifted up. And so Jesus predicts his own lifting up by using that picture of the snake being lifted up in John chapter 3. In addition to events that are used as models, historical persons are also used from the past to speak of future realities or just to paint a picture of the future for us. And so we have, for instance, the usage of Elijah as a symbol for John the Baptist. And so that's where we get some of the confusion. Is this John that's to come? And Jesus says, if you are able to accept it, yes, this is Elijah. And so, you know, there's this semi-confusion. Is this literally Elijah? Well, no, it's not literally Elijah, but yes, it is Elijah in the sense that he is the one who comes, he is the prophet that leads the way, and he is the fulfillment of the promise that Elijah would lead the way for the Messiah. So it's a sign that is utilized with this picture of a man. The third principle for interpreting prophecy that Kaiser gives is that recurring prophetic formulas mark the presence of prophetic passages. So he talks about different phrases that are used repeatedly to mark the beginning or the presence of predictive prophecies. And so I'll just read through these quickly. Statements like in the latter days, or in the last days, or in the days to come. The usage of the phrase the day of the Lord. The usage of the phrase the Lord comes. The usage of the phrases return the fortunes of my people, or return the captivity. The remnant shall return is the fifth one. The dwelling or the tabernacle of God is with men. References to the kingdom of God oftentimes are references to the presence of the prophetic. And so those can be just indicators that what you're dealing with in this particular instance is a prophetic passage. The fourth category that he talks about, or the fourth principle of interpreting prophecy, is that certain prophetic terms are I wish I could read my own writing. Certain prophetic terms are, hold on, I'll get it to you, are rich with allusions. Certain prophetic terms are rich with allusions. And so when we get into the prophetic, and what he means by this, again, is this whole idea of having to read correctly the language that is given to us. So some of the language that is typical or often contained in the prophetic and is our major prophetic or major interpretive challenges would be, number one, the term earth. If you didn't know this, the word for earth in both Hebrew and Greek can mean either earth or land. Now, having said that, the term earth to a 21st century person means the globe. The term Earth to an ancient didn't necessarily mean a globe, meaning in comparison to Mars and Venus and all of those things. When we think about planet Earth, we think about this huge blue orb. That was not the picture that entered into the mind of the ancient when they spoke about Earth. Typically, when they talked about the Earth, they were speaking about two contexts. Well, maybe three. Earth meaning the actual dirt, the earth. We use it in the same way. I have a handful of earth. It's very earthy. So there was that connotation in the term for both the Hebrew and the Greek word. The Hebrew word is eretz, and the Greek word is geis. The second connotation was land. And here specifically in Old and New Testaments, this term land referred not so much to a plot of land, my own land, although it could refer to that, but the land of Israel in distinction to the land of the Gentiles or the surrounding land. Even today, if you fly into Israel, you will hear Israel referred to, the nation of Israel referred to as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, or the earth of Israel. It's not typically in ancient language referred to cosmologically. Now, having said that, the phrase heavens and the earth is a common phrase in the Old Testament. And so our modern mind also wants to say that in that context, then the interpreters are referring to what we would typically know as the earth. That too is semi-debatable. The cosmology of the ancient world was not a modern cosmology. The phrasing heavens and earth oftentimes not only referred to the sky and the land that we live on, yes, but it wasn't in terms of a kind of a modern, Milky Way kind of a picture, the galaxy, revolving around the sun kind of idea that we would have when we talk about heavens and earth. Heavens and earth would have been a much more localized idea. And I think we've talked a little bit about this before, but heavens and earth oftentimes refers to the connectivity between the heaven and the earth, the place where heaven and earth meets. There's some discussion as to whether heaven and earth was a technical term for the temple, because in Old Testament or ancient times, temple architecture really was a reflection of the heavens from their perspective. Just like medieval cathedral architecture is a reflection of the cross, so the ancient temple architecture was a reflection of the cosmos, or the connection between heaven and earth. But nonetheless, the term earth, you should not quickly jump to a picture of a globe. You should more think of a localized picture, specifically land, and then move outward from there. So whenever you see the word earth in the New Testament or the Old Testament, you want to be aware of I think there's a modern bias that we've really not worked through in our interpretive or our translations. I generally, when I see those words now, kind of step back and say, is this passage understandable with just speaking about the land of Israel? So you can see where this would make a huge difference in your interpretation of some of the passages of Revelation, where you have this destruction over a third of the earth or a third of the land. You start saying, well, okay, is he talking about the globe, the whole earth, or is he talking about a localized judgment that's going to come on the nation or the land of Israel? And again, this would be a critical kind of distinction that you'd want to make initially. This would be an exegetical challenge for you. So that term earth in a prophetic context needs to be understood with that sort of emphasis or range of meaning. The second term that is often used in the prophetic that has a meaning that seems to go beyond its basic or literal meaning would be the term sea. Oftentimes the sea would refer to more than a large body of water. It could, at times in Daniel, it seems to represent the nations as a whole, referred to as a sea. This would also make sense because sometimes it seems and the reason I'm going to emphasize it seems is because you need to do this work in each and every passage to see what exactly is the term sea referencing. Is it referencing a literal sea? Is it being used metaphorically for a large group of people, nations? And if so, that would be an appropriate kind of definition, because sometimes sea also refers to chaos or evil. So if I'm talking about the surrounding nations that are surrounding Israel, and Israel being in the center of that picture, and that the sea is surrounding it, it would symbolize this chaotic, unbelieving, out of control group of people that surrounds the nation of Israel that still needs to be redeemed and brought back into the context of God's people. So sea at sometimes will represent something more than just a large body of water. When we talk about the term sands of the sea and the stars of the heavens, again, we're not talking necessarily about specific stars and actually going down and counting the number of grains of sand on the ocean. But we're talking again possibly about large and innumerable amount of people. Again, that stems all the way back to the promise made to Abraham, or that first predicted promise we read from Genesis 15. Your people will be like the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea. The phrase day of clouds or dark day of darkness, blood and fire, billows of smoke, the sun turned to darkness, noon into blood. These kinds of this kind of language is often what is referred to as cosmic dissolution language. So are we literally talking about the sun turning into blood, or the moon turning into blood, or the sun being darkened? We're talking about a phenomenon that occurs from the perspective of humans looking up, not a literal turning of the blood into moon. It's not actually going to become a big ball of blood. So what is represented by those pictures? Those pictures would be cosmological confusion. They would be just kind of the end of all things. The sky is falling is probably our most modern metaphorical connect to those pictures. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. Things are just coming apart at the seams. The world is coming to an end. But even when I say that the world is coming to an end, I might not mean, some sort of nuclear holocaust or meteoric destruction of the whole world. I just mean my world is coming to an end. And so in the first century, much of this language could very easily relate to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and the demolition or destruction of the nation of Israel by the Romans. It's language that is speaking very graphically about a localized fall of power, loss of blessing. So cosmic dissolution language occurs throughout the scriptures. So you have it in the classic Joel chapter 2, verse 16, quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 2. So a literalist would look at Acts chapter 2 and you'd see that Peter quotes from Joel, and he would want to say, well, that really didn't happen, so it must happen in the future. Whereas you could understand that language to be more appropriately describing what is in fact impending upon the nation of Israel, this change, this period of judgment that's coming upon them, this window of mercy that God is allowing before he fulfills the words that Jesus spoke about the destruction of the temple, which essentially is the destruction of the nation. And so that language would be completely appropriate in that instance and in that case. Coming on the clouds is another one of those kinds of language. So if you compare Revelation chapter 1, where people see Jesus coming on the clouds, and compare that with Isaiah chapter 19, where The nation of Egypt is described as a tool of judgment in the hands of God. And in that passage, God is described as coming on the clouds. And really what is being described there is that God is going to use, is going to judge Egypt. So it says there, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. So this kind of language, this heavy, exaggerated judgment language, is something that's very common throughout the prophetic prophets, especially in the book of Revelation. You know, when we talk about blood being shed that rises up to the bridles of horses, you know, there's probably not that much blood in the population of the world right now to actually have that be literally true in any sense. So, you know, what we're seeing here is very powerful language that is extreme, hyperbolic, used to describe the judgment that's impending. And so you've got those things. Another term that is rich with allusions that's used in the prophetic is the north. So oftentimes we talk about armies arriving from the north. Gog and Magog are from the north. And so we've talked about in current prophetic conversations that must mean Russia or some nation that is immediately north of the nation of Israel. Again, that would be the literalistic approach, that it has to be something that's directly north of Israel. But what you need to understand, number one, historically, just even if you're going to take that literally, it doesn't necessarily mean that. The approach to Jerusalem, if you were an army other than Egypt, an army coming from the south, so this would include the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Syrians themselves. Any nation that was going to attack the nation of Israel would not attack them from the west, because they were protected by a large desert and a huge rift valley, which was literally impossible to move armies in and through. You wouldn't attack from the west. We're not talking about sophisticated naval entities being in existence during those periods of time, so there wouldn't be any armies that would attack them from the west. If any army was going to attack Israel, they were going to come from the north. The north became just this standard term of where enemies came from. Even the city of Jerusalem, the way that it's situated, is surrounded by valleys all around it, on the east, the south, and the west. The only area where the city of Jerusalem is unprotected, the most vulnerable part of the city, is the north part of the city. And so this term north isn't necessarily referring to a literal nation that is from the north. Whenever it's referred to, it's typically referring to the vulnerable part of the nation and where the enemies entered into the nation. So it becomes a term that would just simply describe the enemies. Countries that would, or people that would attack from the north, would be any enemy of Israel that wasn't coming directly from the south. And again, if you look at any map, the only country that's coming from the south is Egypt, and everything else is going to come from the north. And then another prophetic term that's often used is the marriage of the Lamb. And again, that obviously is a figurative picture. So symbols are filled, prophecy is filled with symbols, especially the kind of prophecy that is termed apocalyptic. By definition, apocalyptic prophecy is prophecy that is riddled with symbolism. That, in fact, is part of the definition of apocalyptic literature, is that it's filled with symbolism. And symbols in the apocalyptic either need to be explained by the immediate context. Secondly, they need to be explained by the parallels that are being used from the Old Testament. The Old Testament imagery is often used, especially in the book of Revelation, as the imagery of the prophetic. I often say to people, don't read the Bible or the prophecies of the Bible, the book of Revelation, with a newspaper in your hand. You need to read it with the Old Testament in your hand, because much of the symbolism is drawn from the Old Testament, specifically from the Exodus, a lot of it from the Exodus. And then lastly, there are some symbols that are in the apocalyptic literature that are unexplained, either in the context or in the Old Testament. So they just sometimes become very difficult to decipher. So for instance, one of those is 666. It's a difficult thing to decipher. Another one in the book of Revelation will be the white stone that's referenced in Revelation 2. And so we sometimes just have to work with what we have, and we don't have a whole lot of answers. All right. A couple of things before we kind of close this lecture out. When you read the prophetic, I think, especially in the Old Testament, I think you want to see a primary ultimate fulfillment in the first coming of Christ. If you can't harmonize prophecies with the first coming of Christ, then it seems to me that that might open the door for some future prediction or future connection or referent for that prophecy. But as we've spoken of this idea of double fulfillment, one of the things that we talk about with the idea of double fulfillment is there's kind of a three-pronged approach to understanding prophecy. So we start with the actual prophetic utterance, or the divine word, the word that actually precedes the event, the prophecy itself. And then we look for what we might call the near fulfillment. And that near fulfillment is an affirmation of the prophetic word. It's like a historic restatement of the word. So you have the divine word preceding the event, and then we have a near referent that fulfills the prophecy, but remains as also a symbol for what's yet to come. And then you have the climactic or the ultimate fulfillment of that prophecy, typically in the first advent of Christ, the first coming of Christ. And I would caution you to start reading much of the Old Testament in that way and finding its fulfillment, if you can, in the first coming of Christ. I think you'll be surprised by how much of what you thought was unfulfilled prophecy has a lot of touch points or reference in the first coming of Christ. And then what I would say is that if there is an additional referent or fulfillment, it's just a repetition or an affirmation of all that Christ came to accomplish in his first coming. And so I see one of the key elements of interpreting prophecy as keeping the incarnation, the atonement, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and I want to emphasize this, and the ascension of Christ, which is something that we've really neglected in Protestant circles, as part of the fabric of what the Old Testament is pointing to in its fullness. And then when we attach this idea of what we call inaugurated eschatology, we've talked about that, the now and the not yet, that there are some things in prophecy that appear to be in place now, but they still seem to have a fullness that's yet to come. And I would say the Great Commission is a great picture of this, that part of eschatology is this cooperative work between Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the Church in fulfilling the Great Commission. And so all the pieces are in place, and now the work of the Church is the element that brings about the fulfillment of the kingdom. And so that, I think that picture in terms of an eschatological framework is an important and a powerful one. All right, so that brings to a close this lecture on interpreting prophecy.